Um, I've got a couple of things to say. First of all, my name is Alex Ding. Thank you very much for coming. You'll notice that I'm on my own. Unfortunately, Gemma had to drop out of this presentation, so I'd like to acknowledge her contribution in conversations that have led up to this and various work we've done together. But I take responsibility for what you're about to see. I'd also like to acknowledge someone who's here called Alex, and Alex did an MA dissertation with me, and that's informed some of the ideas here. It's a fantastic dissertation that looks at EAP practitioners from the outside perspective. I'll give you the reference for it later, but those two people have informed some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So I haven't really got the most exciting of titles, so I'm quite surprised to see there's more than 10 people here. What I'm planning to do today is to talk through three aspects of practitioners and how they're represented. But first of all, we've got a kind of paradox in the ESP profession and the AP profession, more specifically, is that we know the least about ourselves. Now, this is a strange idea. We're all practitioners, we're all here. We know about EAP practitioners and practice, but there is no documentation or very little documentation of a practitioner, their lives, their interests, their identity, almost nothing. And this seems to me a curious anomaly when you look at, say, the literature in TESOL, where identity, beliefs, knowledge, and so on form quite a substantial part of the literature. So why has the EAP practitioner been somewhat ignored? Okay. It's a paradox in the sense that we are at a point in our history in EAP where we're kind of catching up with events. There's been a huge expansion in EAP. There's been a huge increase in the number of practitioners, and yet we've devoted little to no attention to them. So, I'm going to be talking about practitioner perspectives. In other words, gathering various views from practitioners, which I'll show in a minute. Sorry, this is slightly strange. Insider perspectives. So that's what documentation, what literature, what research has been done on the practitioner and has been made publicly available through publications and so on. And in the last section, I'm going to be talking about how do you get to a deeper understanding of the practitioner? What kind of research, what kind of things do we need to do in order to understand the practitioner a bit better? So that's the plan. I would like to insist quite heavily upon the idea that this is really fragments of evidence. It's a scrapbook of things that I've collated over the years through my own research and PhD, through scholarly activities, through emails, through conferences, and so on. It's also been drawing on Gemma's dissertation, my own PhD, things I've written more recently on teacher education and development in EAP, which will be published sometime September, maybe a bit later. And also Alex Hudson's MA dissertation, which has just been completed. Those are the kind of primary sources for that. But as I say, I would insist very much that they're fragments rather than any solid evidence. What I'm going to do is to show you what I think are some of the more controversial or problematic tropes that appear in these kind of publications and what I've witnessed and so on, to draw attention to where I think there are some problems. Now, you probably can't see this. I did expect a slightly bigger screen, but it's not very important. If you can read that, your eyesight's fine. If that, you don't worry about it. Okay? And what we notice is, for example, in the first example of fragmented collective identity, we know that EAP centres exist in all sorts of different places and they're subject to all sorts of change, moving around from being in an administrative centre to an academic one or shifting and so on. So there's no common place for an EAP centre to exist. This is problematic, not only within the UK, but we also know very little about how EAP centres function on a much broader level globally. In doing some recent research to try and find out what goes on a global scale, this has been very, very difficult to actually find any evidence, any examples of EAP practice beyond the UK in terms of the practitioner. There is a sense of displacement in always being moved from department, office to office, not really knowing where you fit in. One of the common tropes was the idea of EAP work as being like working in a sausage factory. It's the idea that you're doing the same thing over and over again. I'm not presenting visions or views which are uniform. There is a great divergence in views. I'm just signalling the ones which I think are problematic or difficult. Lots of people are very happy in their job, but there are slightly contentious areas around that. The linking of factory work to careers is quite important because there is no obvious career structure within EAP. You join a unit, a centre, you do teaching, and then you do less teaching. You take a managerial route. Now, I don't want to be a manager, which is the only option I've got. So it doesn't necessarily encourage those that invest heavily in their teaching and good at teaching if the idea is then that the only route you go to is managing other people. And management and teaching are not the same skills. So one of the problems is for teachers that get into EAP is, well, what do you do then? Do you do more of it? Do you do slightly different variations of it? Or do you become a manager? But then otherwise, there's not really a clear route. One of the major issues that comes out is notions of recognition. This is particularly problematic with the idea of only teaching. Teaching is somehow perceived as being second-rate because there's no recognition within the university of this being a valuable activity. I would contest that quite a lot, but that's a view that's often put forward. Whether one should be comparing ourselves to people on teaching and research contracts anyway is debatable. But often the comparison is to be seen, or the perception is to be seen as somehow inferior. Which links to ideas of identity, who practitioners think they are and what they should be doing. In this case, being a language teacher, and the focus here is quite interesting on language, rather than being part of academia, part of education, and not a researcher. So there is often certain hostility towards the idea of the practitioner being someone that does investigate, does do scholarly activity, that does do research, and quite a strong notion that that's not for them. I suppose that people come into EAP quite often through an EFL route where if you choose that kind of career, it's not necessarily because you want to be a researcher. But nonetheless, that causes problems if you are working in HE. Ideologically, I think there's a great deal of divergence about understanding the present socio-political context that we live in. We hear lots about neoliberalism and about the oppressive nature of commodification and so on, but not everyone lives that apparently as a problem. There are people that actually think and believe that EAP is a business and it should be run like one. So the divergence of views about EAP, if you consider it can be an industry, a discipline, and a professional practice, then there are seemingly quite divergent views on where the practitioner sits in. Are we providing student service? Are we making money for the university? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And there are quite divergent views on whether that's the case or not. There's a sense of alienation at times about not being paid to develop. I will do my job. And there seems to be kind of tropes around the ideas that practitioners perhaps identify themselves in different ways. EAP as a vocation, EAP as a career and EAP as a job. And I'm not saying that people remain in those silos, but they seem to fall into one of those three groups. And the last thing, which I think is important, is that development is seen as kind of ad hoc, reactive coping, responding to situations and developing as a need when the needs arise, rather than being a planned development, as being something that projects towards an ideal or a goal. Opportunities arise, new courses are given, new demands are made, and often development follows reactively to that rather than setting a path. So those are some of the tropes that came out of, that I wanted to show you and talk to you about, that kind of cause problems, I think, that lead to a slightly fragmented view and disenfranchised practitioner. Now, I'm not suggesting by any means, as I said earlier, that this is the views of everybody, or even a majority, but it does seem to fall around these categories of EAP as factory work, issues around recognition, the identity of practitioners, sometimes a sense of alienation, different ideological values that people have who do EAP, problems of career and managerialism, and I think globally a fragmented identity. We don't have a very coherent EAP practitioner identity, even within the UK, and if you move beyond that, it becomes quite diverse and quite disparate. So those are the views that I'd like to present to you of the disenfranchised, upset practitioner. But if you move to what's actually publicly available through the literature, it's actually rather strange. The complete lack of insight from the literature on the practitioner, and the practitioner has somehow slipped out of discussions, publications, even conferences. If you look through the programme for today, tomorrow, and Sunday, I don't think there are many that focus specifically on the practitioner. There's at least one. Okay. I did hedge my bets a bit, but there is at least one. But it's not a major theme here, by any means. And I think that's interesting. One of the things that comes out of the literature is, you can't read that. I can't, sorry, anyway. Okay. There are common tropes in the literature. One of the things is, and I think the first point leads on to the second, is that ELT provides a kind of reference point for EAP in any descriptions of it. Perhaps less so now, but EAP kind of defines itself about how it's not ELT. So usually in a way that makes EAP sound much better. Okay? So, but it kind of needs that anchor point of ELT in order to define itself, which is kind of interesting because you would imagine that perhaps EAP would be moving more towards a comparison of what goes on in HE as a more accurate comparison. The second point is the obsession with and often a deficit view of the novice practitioner. I don't want to labour this point, but I think there are historical reasons why the novice became slightly obsessed, and I think it's probably to do with the expansion of EAP that we've seen over the last 15 years, and quite a large number of people teaching EAP, and a worry perhaps about standards and quality and so on. But nonetheless, there is a very, very negative deficit model of people who join EAP, which I think is not serving a very useful purpose. So those are fairly two common features of this. I want to talk a little bit and do a little bit of BALEAP bashing just for a little while. Just a little bit, partly because the competency framework for TEEP, which is about 10 years old now, I think, roughly around that. No, 8 years old. Started off as being a kind of document, as I understood it, where it was supposed to provide some kind of guidance about what sort of competencies were needed to teach EAP. And it was a guide. Bruce has described it as a bid for membership and participation in the EAP discourse community. I've highlighted membership because I think it's more about membership than participation. It's more about assimilating and becoming part of an established community, thank you, rather than the participation. Now, the problem with the competency framework is that once you've become a member of this community, how do you move beyond assimilating and reproducing practices within EAP? How do you transform them? How do you move on to the next stage? The actual framework represents a holotype of the EAP practitioner. It's an ideal. And a holotype means there's one unique view of the practitioner. A polytype would be something which would have variations of it, which would seem to correspond perhaps with more or a less UK-centric view of EAP. It lacks contextual sensitivity and range. It's unclear whether this framework really has much reach beyond the UK. And I think it's important in the context of BALEAP, where the strapline is the global, has a sort of global ambitions. I've read a book recently about EAP in Asia and the kind of contextual conditions in which EAP is undertaken in places like Sri Lanka and Pakistan and so on are unrecognisable for the kinds of things that we do here, just because of the context. So how would you teach 300 students when we worry about 16 or 18 in the class? Things like that. There's no documented account of the methodology used to create this. Now, these aren't problems in themselves, and they weren't problems as a kind of guide in order to kind of establish or gauge what goes on in EAP. But the problem is what it's been used for. Now, there's been no public critique, written critique of the competencies framework. It's been pretty much universally acknowledged as being a good thing, but it becomes an underpinning for course accreditation, for induction programs, a basis for teacher observations, for postgraduate courses, teacher development, and accreditation scheme. And that's quite a leap, I think, from that original document to what it's being used for without any kind of what I would call public scrutiny. So I'm being slightly deliberately critical of it and pointing out things because I don't think there is much discussion of that. But these are the kind of perspectives that emerge, and it's a very surreptitious kind of image of the practitioner because there isn't anything really out there. One of the problems with this framework in particular and how it's used is the emphasis on experienced practitioner, as if that's a good in itself. In an ideal world, you accumulate experience, knowledge, wisdom, and you have something to impart or share. But I don't think that's any more than a very rough guide to the competencies that a particular practitioner has. I don't think experience in itself is something that guarantees a mentorship type status. Again, there's a kind of negation and slightly pejorative view of the novice in comparison. So, in a sense, privilege is accorded by how long you've been doing it. And I really think that's highly problematic. So, just to recap, they're assimilated into this community through what I would call a norm-enforcing practitioner development framework. You become part of that community by assimilating the values and competencies that are there. That's how you join. But I do think it neglects a more critical perspective, and I think that's the area which needs to be pushed more strongly and more fully. Okay, that's enough BALEAP bashing. Now, what's slightly more disappointing is that when you do look at the literature, a persistent but very marginal comment about the practitioner is to notice the status and marginalisation of the practitioner, but suggesting absolutely nothing to alleviate it. So it's noted constantly from 1991 and before about the marginal status, etc., but it's noted. There's no suggestions about how that might change. And it comes out in things like lack of a common title for professional roles, roles poorly understood by others, no clear or appropriate career structure, promotional rewards, and the increasing casualisation of teaching. Liz Lyons noticed kind of an increasing divorce of EAP academics from practitioners. I organised a EAP in the Midlands session a while ago, and one person, I don't think he said it facetiously, but it was like, you know, if you get out of EAP, if you've got academic ambitions, you move out of it, which seems a shame. So the insider perspectives, the kind of things that you see published, often lament the fact that practitioners are marginalised, etc. Now the problem, again, with that is it's a very Australian, UK perspective. We don't know particularly what goes on in Norway or in Germany or in other countries where the status of EAP practitioners might be quite different. I'm saying that as a question mark because I don't know, but I don't think we know. So again, the location of an EAP practitioner in their context might have a higher status than perhaps we think. Okay, now it gets complicated. I think that we've reached a point where we need to pay far greater attention to the practitioner, and this should become a focus. It's a sort of, the profession has been catching up with economic and social events, with increasing neoliberal views of the university and instrumental views of international students, expansion of EAP, all of those sorts of things. I think BALEAP has been protecting a sort of certain professionalism through the competency framework, and protecting the profession as such, and that's all good. But I think we've reached a point now where we need to focus on the experiences and the perspectives of practitioners. How we do that is slightly complex because I've got about 5 minutes and 2 slides to go. But with a focus on reflexivity, and by that I mean a very specific notion. It's often used synonymously with reflection, but the kind of reflexivity I'm talking about is the type of reflections that occur in a moment where you're provoked, or there's been a particular event of significance that makes you question your commitment, your values, and your actions. Reflexivity is a particularly useful term because it links your thoughts with your actions. It's not divorced from the two. And I think we need to, or I'm certainly interested in, the notion of ideology and how macro-structural forces of economics, of public discourse about the university, and so on, how that interplays with ideas of what the practitioner is and what they do, how the two influence each other. I make certain assumptions about that in the sense that I take the intersubject itself as being the kind of basis of what we're talking about as an individual, and that means an individual which is fully woven into others. We don't live as Robinson Crusoe on an island, and how we structure our views of the world are very much integrated with others. And the idea that the self and the structure are related is very important, because otherwise we are shaped by the world we're in, very much so. When we're not born into the world into conditions we would like, and certainly not professionally. But to avoid a kind of determinism about things, we also have, we can shape our world. So the two work together dialectically. Now, this is going to probably give you a headache. Okay? In order to do that, you need to delve a little bit deeper into what is reflexive self. This is what I do when I can't write. Okay? I draw. But it helps me think about it. This is a model of the reflexive self, which is basically made up of a magpie approach to philosophy, and it's a very social philosophy that I'm suggesting that forms the basis of reflexive self. It's made up of the narrative self, which comes from Paul Ricoeur and hermeneutic philosophy, which is interesting because it talks about narrative and the narrative accounts, so we could translate that to practitioners, about things like emplotment. So when we tell our stories about ourselves, who we situate in those stories and what parts they play give a quite strong indication of who is important, who's had influence, and so on. So part of ourselves are made up through narrative accounts of who we are. The embodied self comes from Merleau-Ponty, and that's very important because that runs parallel to all the work that's been done on affordances, and he's a precursor to that. But the important thing about Merleau-Ponty is that we work within objective affordances in the world. We work not in a social constructivist world where anything goes. There are real things about the world that we have to take account of. It's not just bringing things into reality. We work against and with the material world. Mead's view, and this is very important, I think, if we do research, is we often, in dialogues, internal dialogues, we situate ourselves from the position of a generalized other. So within the profession, we often imagine ourselves from the perspective of others, important others in our lives. So this is kind of, we take the standpoint from the perspective of society. When we measure what we want to do, we imagine what other people will think about what we do. But the most important part is from Margaret Archer, who's a critical realist. And she makes the link between internal dialogue, discernment, moving on to deliberation, and then dedication. So reflexivity isn't a kind of critical spirit that attempts to destroy all what we have, but just to question it, reaffirm it, adjust what we do. So from my point of view, if we're going to look at practitioners' lives and try to explain disenfranchisement, alienation, and the various perspectives on the practitioner, we need to have quite a solid philosophical ground to be able to do that. We need to know what we're talking about when we're talking about reflexivity. And these offer various different fields or avenues, if you like, in which the practitioner must end now. Okay. That's pretty much it. I would have liked to say a little bit more about how that research takes place. But in the last slide, I wanted just simply to offer a way in which we can perhaps move forward from these two slightly disparate views of the practitioner from outside, and the ones that practitioners seem to be coming through in various bits of research. But it is very much a scrapbook type of approach to this. There isn't evidence, and I think it's about time we started looking at the practitioner a bit more seriously. Right, I have to finish now. Thank you.